Can you believe this? One of the scariest warlords in history, the guy they literally called the Scourge of God, didn't die in battle. He didn't die leading tens of thousands of horsemen smashing into Roman fortresses. Nope, he died on his wedding night from a nosebleed. Yeah, that's the story. Sounds like a bad meme, right? Something you'd scroll past on Reddit or Facebook and think, nah, that can't be real. But this is the legend that haunted Europe for over 1,600 years. Now picture the scene, a massive wedding feast. Hundreds of torches lighting up the night, wine flowing like rivers, music pounding so loud the wooden floors are shaking. Drunken Hun warriors yelling and cheering, mugs crashing together, pure chaos. And in the middle of it all, Attila, this terrifying warlord who once made emperors cry into their gold, is celebrating like he's untouchable. But a few hours later, while the laughter and music still echo outside, Attila is found dead. Not from a spear, not from poison, from his own nose. Imagine being the guard on duty that morning. What kind of report do you even give? Boss, the Scourge of God bled out from a nosebleed? Like, really? The man who bullied Rome into paying him truckloads of gold, who stormed across Gaul and nearly reached Paris, suddenly drops dead like some drunk guy in a tavern brawl. It's tragic, sure, but also ridiculous. And that's exactly why this story is so juicy. It's equal parts comedy and nightmare. But before we laugh too hard, let's pump the brakes. Did it actually happen? Could Attila, the most feared horseman in Europe, really die from something so dumb? To figure that out, we've got to rewind the clock, back to 5th century Europe. At that time, the Western Roman Empire was basically a crumbling house held together with duct tape. Corruption everywhere, borders full of holes, armies falling apart. Meanwhile, over in the east, Constantinople still looked shiny and rich. But even they were constantly worried about what was coming over the horizon. And what came was the Huns. Now, the Huns weren't your typical empire builders. They didn't need castles or cities. They were nomads from the steppe, masters of horseback warfare. Their secret weapon wasn't just their bows or their horses, it was fear. They moved fast, struck without warning, and left entire regions trembling. And at the center of this storm was Attila, the nightmare's nightmare. After knocking off his own brother Bleda to rule solo, Attila turned the Huns into a roaming superpower. He forced both East and West Rome to pay him tribute, basically protection money, like a mob boss shaking down the neighborhood. In Gaul, his armies tore through the land like wildfire. If not for a massive allied army stopping him at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, he might have taken Paris centuries before the Eiffel Tower was even an idea. So yeah, this guy was terrifying, which makes his death in 453 such a shock. People thought he was untouchable, like he had the gods themselves on speed dial. And then, he dies because of a nosebleed? If you're confused, don't worry, you're not alone. Even people back then thought, wait, what? That can't be it. The earliest version of this story comes from Jordanes, a Gothic historian writing almost a century later. In his book Getisa, he says Attila got super drunk on his wedding night, passed out, had a nosebleed, and literally drowned in his own blood. Which, what a way to go. But let's not forget, ancient historians didn't just write down facts. They wrote stories with a message. And for the Romans and Byzantines, nothing could be more satisfying than their worst nightmare being taken down by something so embarrassingly ordinary. And that's why this story stuck around for centuries. One, because it's hilarious. A warlord dying of a nosebleed. Easy to remember, easy to retell. Two, because there was no autopsy, no reliable witnesses, just Jordanes. And three, because humans love poetic endings. Alexander the Great? Mystery fever. Cleopatra? Snakebite. Napoleon? Maybe poison. And Attila? Nosebleed. But don't mistake it for just comedy. This story was also weaponized. For the Romans, spreading the tale was a way to humiliate Attila even after death. The guy who terrorized Europe didn't die like a hero, he died like a punchline. And honestly, that's how most people remember him today. So what do we get? Attila the Hun, this horse-riding monster who made the Roman Empire pay up, ends up remembered not for his victories, but for bleeding out on his wedding night. A terrifying tyrant turned into a joke. And that's the thing. This isn't just history. It's the world's oldest meme. A meme that survived 1,600 years, bouncing from one storyteller to another, too funny and too ironic to let die. Which means Attila, the Scourge of God, was defeated not by swords, not by assassins, but by his own nose. And hey, if that made you laugh, cringe, or shake your head, don't just scroll past. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like, share this wild piece of history. Because if a nosebleed can take down Attila, your click can definitely keep stories like this alive for another 1,000 years. Picture this. It's the morning after Attila's wedding. The guards stroll into his tent, expecting to see the all-powerful warlord, the guy who had half of Europe shaking in their sandals, getting ready for another day of pillaging. But nope. Instead, they freeze. Attila's lying there, face red, body still. And then they see it. Blood, running from his nose, sliding into his throat. The Scourge of God, the nightmare of Rome, taken out not by a sword, not by an arrow, but by a nosebleed. Yeah, a nosebleed. Not exactly the Hollywood ending you'd expect for the most feared man in Europe. And of course, this is history we're talking about. When something this bizarre happens, the storytellers rush in to spin it. The first guy who really popularized it? Jordanes, a Gothic historian writing about 100 years later. He put it in his book Getica. Sounds scholarly, right? But honestly, it reads more like a gossip rag than a history book. According to him, Attila drank too much on his wedding night, passed out, and drowned in his own nosebleed. That's the story. Juicy, scandalous, and oh so humiliating. But here's the catch. Jordanes wasn't even alive when it happened. He's just recycling gossip passed down through who knows how many mouths. Think of the kids' game Telephone. You whisper a phrase down the line, and by the end, it's totally garbled. Now imagine that game stretched out over a century. That's the level of accuracy we're dealing with. Jordanes even used the fancy medical word epistaxis. Sounds serious, right? In plain English, it's just a nosebleed. The kind of thing kids get in summer when it's hot. And we're supposed to believe that's what killed the biggest warlord of the age? Technically, yeah, it's possible. A nosebleed can kill you if you've got an aneurysm, a clotting disorder, or you're blackout drunk. But it's rare. Like lottery ticket rare. Still, Jordanes delivers it like it's undeniable fact. And because nobody was around to fact check, no eyewitnesses, no coroners, no receipts, his version stuck. Here's the first big crack in this story. The only real source we've got is a guy writing 100 years later who also happened to hate Attila's guts. Reliable? About as reliable as a Facebook post with 12 exclamation marks. And let's not forget, Jordanes was a Goth. The Goths had been stomped and bullied by Attila's Huns. So of course he'd love to make Attila's death sound like a joke. That's like asking a Cowboys fan to write Tom Brady's biography. Spoiler, it won't be flattering. Outside of Jordanes, what do we get? Almost nothing. Procopius, a Byzantine historian who actually lived closer to Attila's time, barely mentions it. Everyone else? Radio silence. Which is suspicious. I mean, come on. When a figure as huge as Attila dies, you'd expect records, rumors, something everywhere. Why not here? Was it just chaos? Or maybe, just maybe, someone didn't want the real story to spread. Still, the nosebleed wedding night version was too perfect. People loved it. Why? Because it flipped the narrative. The monster of Europe reduced to a punchline. The guy who burned cities, who terrified emperors, going out like a drunk uncle at Thanksgiving dinner. That's not just history. That's poetic justice. And humans eat that stuff up. Here's the bigger point. History isn't just about what happened. It's about which stories survive. And those stories are usually told by the winners, or at least the survivors. In Attila's case, the storytellers were his enemies. And instead of a mighty warrior dying on the battlefield, we're left with Attila the Fool, choking on a nosebleed. And this isn't even unusual. Think of King Harold at the Battle of Hastings, the arrow in the eye guy. Historians aren't sure it even happened that way, but the image stuck because it's vivid. Same with Attila. Nosebleed equals humiliating, easy to remember, perfect meme material for the Middle Ages. But here's where it gets interesting. The official story doesn't really add up. Attila was tough, hardened by decades of war. He's not the type to just keel over from a random nosebleed. And at that moment in history, plenty of people had good reasons to want him gone. Rival Hun nobles, angry Germanic kings, and, oh yeah, the Romans. So was it really an accident? Or was the nosebleed story just a convenient cover for something darker? Poison? An assassination? Maybe even Ildiko herself, his brand new bride, in on it. See the difference? The official story is clean, simple, easy to tell. Attila died of a nosebleed. The possible stories? Messy, complicated, way more intriguing. And maybe that's the real takeaway. Jourdain's version didn't survive because it was true. It survived because it was humiliating, funny, and unforgettable. In history, what lasts isn't always the truth. Sometimes, it's just the best story. Have you ever thought about dying from a nosebleed? Yeah, sounds ridiculous, right? But that's actually the official explanation history gives us for the death of Attila the Hun. Attila, one of the scariest dudes to ever ride a horse. The man who made Rome tremble. And yet, apparently, he didn't fall in battle or to an assassin's blade. Nope. The story goes, he died from the exact same thing fifth graders get at recess on a hot summer day. Now, before you laugh this off as medieval stand-up comedy, let's dig in. Because nosebleeds, what doctors like to call epistaxis, fancy word, same gross result, can actually get pretty nasty. Here's the quick science. Inside your nose, there's this ridiculously dense web of blood vessels called Kisselbach's plexus. Imagine your nose as a tiny faucet, and inside it a tangle of fragile little pipes. If your blood pressure spikes or those pipes weaken, one of them can pop. Boom, nosebleed. Usually, not a big deal. Pinch your nose, tilt forward, wait a couple minutes, done. But in extreme cases, say you're blackout drunk, flat on your back, it's possible to choke on your own blood as it runs down your throat. Disgusting? Yes. Likely. Almost never. And that's where the story of Attila gets shaky. Sure, it could happen, but it's about as rare as winning the Powerball twice in 1 week. Are we really supposed to believe this battle-hardened warlord who survived countless fights just happened to hit that medical lottery? Sounds fishy. So doctors and historians have tossed out other ideas. Aneurysm rupture. A blood vessel bursts in the brain or sinuses. If it's the brain, he collapses instantly. If it's in the nose? Okay, maybe. Bleeding disorder. Maybe he couldn't clot blood properly. But come on, this guy fought through hundreds of battles without bleeding out. Doesn't track. Cirrhosis from alcohol. Now we're talking. Attila was a heavy drinker. Booze wrecks the liver, raises blood pressure, makes veins pop. Still, dying right on the wedding night? That's some suspicious timing. Stroke or heart attack? Honestly, this feels the most reasonable. A brain hemorrhage or cardiac arrest could have taken him fast. The nosebleed could have been a side effect. Or maybe just added later for dramatic effect. So, if you strip the legend down, Attila died of a nosebleed probably translates to he had some catastrophic medical event, maybe fueled by alcohol, and when they found him, blood was everywhere. Later writers just boiled it down to epistaxis. Simpler, punchier, easier to mock. But here's where it gets spicy. This wasn't just any night. It was his wedding night. And his new bride, Ildiko, she was a Germanic noblewoman. Now, quick history reminder. The Huns and the Germanic tribes were not exactly besties. Some theories say maybe Attila didn't just keel over. Maybe he was poisoned. Now, poison usually leaves behind ugly signs, vomiting, convulsions, agony. Not exactly easy to hide, but if someone wanted it to look like a tragic medical accident, pour some wine, stage a little blood at the nose, and suddenly the story writes itself. Voila, the legend of the fatal nosebleed. So why did this version catch on? Easy, it's poetic, think about it. The man who terrorized Europe, brought Rome to its knees, brought down not by an army, but by a tiny weak spot in his face. It's the perfect cosmic joke, like a skyscraper crumbling because someone kicked out one brick. And for Attila's enemies, it was delicious, humiliating, easy to repeat. Equal parts comedy and tragedy. Here's the bigger lesson. Medicine can give us a dozen technical causes. But history? History always picks the simplest, most meme-worthy version. Aneurysm is boring. Heart attack is clinical. Nosebleed on your wedding night? That's a medieval tabloid headline. That sticks. From a modern angle, Attila probably died of some sudden vascular disaster with alcohol playing a part. But from the angle of his enemies, this was karma. Fate itself laughing at him. And the irony? His death didn't just end him. It shattered his empire. His sons fought. His allies bailed. The Huns collapsed almost overnight. For Rome, it was the sweetest revenge imaginable. The monster destroyed, not by a hero's sword, but by a nosebleed. So next time you hear, Attila died of a nosebleed, don't just laugh. Remember, behind that irony is a real debate. Medical, political, cultural, it shows how one bizarre death morphed into a lasting legend. And more importantly, it shows how history works. It's not always the truth that survives. Sometimes, it's just the funniest story. Imagine this. Morning after Attila's wedding. The guards push into his tent, expecting to see their boss, the Scourge of God, gearing up for another day of burning villages and scaring emperors. Instead, they freeze. Attila's flat on his back, face flushed, blood trickling out of his nose, pooling down his throat. Not exactly the heroic picture the Huns had in mind for their living legend. Some guards shout, some scramble, trying to cover him up. And outside, tens of thousands of warriors just stunned. The man who made Rome grovel? Gone. Just like that. And let's be honest, when someone that powerful drops dead overnight, history never just shrugs and says, "Oh well, bad luck." Nah, that smells like conspiracy. So, who did it? First suspect, the bride, Ildiko. On paper, she's the tragic young widow, married one night, widowed the next. But come on, she was Germanic nobility, married off to the guy who had stomped all over her people. That's not exactly a rom-com setup. Some whisper she poisoned him. Others say she had a blade hidden under the sheets. Truth is, there's no evidence. No witnesses. No follow-up. History just lets her vanish into the mist, which, let's be real, only makes the story spicier. Now let's zoom in on the Hun camp. Attila's empire? Massive, but it was held together with duct tape and fear. Sons, generals, rivals, all circling the throne like vultures. His sudden death? A little too convenient. Within a year, the whole empire collapsed. Brothers fighting brothers, tribes walking out. It was chaos. Think mafia movie. The Don drops dead and the whole family goes nuclear. Wedding night. Accident. Maybe just the perfect cover for a power grab. And then, Rome. Oh, don't act surprised. You know those senators toasted with their best wine the second they heard the news. No more invasions, no more gold payouts. Problem solved. But were they just lucky? Or did Roman hands reach across the frontier into Attila's bedchamber? Remember, Rome practically invented political assassination. They stabbed Julius Caesar in broad daylight. If they'd kill their own guy in the Senate, you think they'd hesitate to knock off a barbarian warlord? Please. Here's the funny part, though. Rome stayed quiet, never claimed credit. Why? Because the official version, Attila dies from a nosebleed on his wedding night, was too good to mess with. It humiliated him. It made him look weak. And best of all, it made it feel like divine punishment. Not a Roman dagger, not a poisoned chalice, but fate itself. That's the kind of headline you frame and hang on the wall. And don't forget the Germanic tribes serving under Attila. They'd fought for him, sure, but under duress. The second he was gone, they bolted. Could one of them have pulled the plug early, taken the risk to free their people? Pretty convenient, considering they were the same tribes who smashed the Huns at the Battle of Nidau just a year later. Now, of course, there's the boring theory. The medical one. Maybe he had sky-high blood pressure, maybe an aneurysm, maybe his heart just gave out. Modern doctors say the nosebleed death doesn't really check out, unless you win the worst lottery in history. More likely it was some catastrophic medical event. But let's face it, Attila dies of hypertension doesn't exactly sell scrolls. Scourge of God drowns in his own blood? Now that people will remember. And that's the whole point. People didn't cling to the nosebleed story because it was accurate. They clung to it because it was the perfect humiliation. A cosmic joke. The kind of ending that makes a legend unforgettable. And the fallout? Brutal. The empire collapsed overnight. His sons tore each other apart. His enemies celebrated. Within a few years, the Huns were nothing but a memory. The cruelest twist? Attila isn't remembered first for terrorizing Europe. He's remembered for bleeding out on his honeymoon. If it was a conspiracy, the killers didn't just take his life. They stole his legend. And that's the real lesson here. In history, truth doesn't always win. The best story does. Picture this. A cold morning in the year 453, somewhere out on the Pannonian Plain. The drums are beating, not for war this time, but for a funeral. Attila, the Scourge of God himself, is being laid to rest. Legend says his body was sealed inside not one, not two, but 3 coffins, gold, silver, and iron. Sounds pretty extravagant, right? Like the VIP section of the afterlife. And then, plot twist, every single worker at the funeral was killed, so no one could ever reveal the burial site. Which is why, even now, nobody has the slightest clue where Attila's grave actually is. He just disappeared into the earth, just like his empire would vanish only a few years later. And at that moment, Attila stopped being a man and became a legend. But here's the real question. Why are we still talking about his death centuries later? Why does this ridiculous story, dying from a nosebleed on his wedding night, stick around like the ultimate bad meme of history? Well, first off, because it marked the end of an era. Attila wasn't just the leader of the Huns. He was Europe's living nightmare. The moment he died, the Hun Empire unraveled. His sons turned on each other, the Germanic tribes rebelled, and before long, the empire collapsed faster than your Wi-Fi after you've just paid the bill. Second, his death is a masterclass in propaganda. The Romans and Byzantines didn't need to fight another war. They didn't need to raise armies. They just needed a story. And what a story it was. The Scourge of God, taken out not by swords, not by assassins, but by his own nose. It spread, it stuck, and centuries later, people still repeat it. Proof that history isn't just written in blood. It's written with a sharp pen, usually by your enemies. Third, it shows the fragility of power. You can terrify nations, you can command armies, you can make emperors tremble. But sometimes, all it takes to bring you down is one tiny, treacherous blood vessel. That's the bitter little punchline. No matter how mighty you think you are, sometimes your own body turns against you. Philosophers later used Attila as a perfect example of vanitas, the vanity, the futility of worldly power. And fourth, this is the fun part. Attila's death has fueled culture for centuries. He shows up in Dante's Divine Comedy, in Germanic sagas, in countless stories and even movies. In Hungary and Italy, people still whisper about his lost tomb, like it's some kind of ancient national treasure waiting to be found. Every time a farmer digs up a random piece of metal near the Tisa River, someone says, "Hey, maybe that's Attila's gold." But maybe the most important lesson is this. The nosebleed story isn't really about medicine or chance. It's about how people deal with fear. The Romans were terrified of Attila. They couldn't deny his power, but they sure as hell weren't going to let him go down in history as some kind of unstoppable hero. So they laughed. They turned him into a punchline. And once fear becomes laughter, it loses its grip. And that's why Attila's death feels less like a historical record and more like the world's oldest meme. It's absurd, it's catchy, and it's unforgettable. Today, scholars argue he probably died from a stroke or an aneurysm or even foul play. But let's be honest, most people don't remember those theories. They remember the nosebleed, because in the eternal battle between truth and a good story, the good story always wins. So why does Attila's death still matter today? Because it reminds us that history isn't just what happened. It's what people chose to believe happened. It's how fear turns into myth, how power becomes mockery, and how even the greatest names can be undone by the tiniest detail. Think about it. Attila, a man who once made Europe tremble, is remembered less for his victories than for bleeding out of his nose on his wedding night. And the irony? That ridiculous ending is the very thing that made him unforgettable. So, the next time you hear his name, you might imagine the fierce horseman, the ruthless conqueror. But you'll also smirk at the nosebleed. And in that moment, you'll be doing exactly what the Romans did centuries ago, turning terror into ridicule. That's Attila's true legacy. Not the empire he built, but the joke history made of his death. And hey, if you enjoyed this wild ride through history's weirdest plot twist, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and share it with a friend. Because if Attila's nosebleed can survive 600 years, this story deserves at least a few more clicks.